good stuff. We've got the good stuff,
We
even
have
if we're
got
not
the
the
good
stuff.
stuff. Cheers.
Yeah, cheers. Okay. Well, so welcome to the good stuff with me, Andy Farnell, and
Me, Kate Brown.
Kate is a attachment-based psychoanalytical psychotherapist from the UKCP.
Yeah, and you are a computer scientist specialising in...
No, you can say, and Andy is a computer scientist with a very big beard.
Yes, an enormous beard. People, you should see it. It's enormous. It's huge.
It's getting there.
You are channeling your inner Father Christmas right now.
I've got my
tell.
lockdown beard.
So Dan has asked us to talk about immunity passports, and I want to set the parameters of what I'm able to talk about with some knowledge and what I'm not able to talk about with much knowledge. I'm not an immunologist, so I don't know about the research that would govern the idea of research of immunity passports. I also am not a computer scientist who understands how such a plan would be implemented, and I'm rather reliant on your expertise in that area. I think that the reason why Dan has asked me to be here this evening to talk and think about a wider issue of immunity is because what is likely to be the case is that very strong unconscious feelings will be behind the current social discourse about immunity and whether immunity passports are a good thing or a bad thing.
I guess we could both go through an almost endless list of things that we are not experts on.
Yeah.
And
but I think it's particularly important right now, given the fact that what has really characterised a discussion about the current COVID-19 pandemic is just the sheer amount of disinformation.
Huge amounts of disinformation. You know, everyone's an armchair pundit.
Yeah.
And we can be armchair pundits because that's what we do in our spare time.
Yeah.
You know. But there are people, men, and there's such a crisis in leadership. And there are so many people today who are professional armchair pundits.
Yeah.
Every politician has something to say about economics, as if they were born with an innate understanding of economics. Mm. And almost none of them have ever looked at the theory or read a book on economics, but suddenly being empowered seems to imbue you with a natural knowledge of it, you know. And every politician and so-called leader seems to think that they have an understanding about technology because, you know, they own a phone or they type their accounts in on a spreadsheet. The real experts, as far as I can see, have very little voice, are selected from a very specific pool of ideas, of thinkers. And so we would be in very good company if most of what we were talking was shite. However, I really hope that we can raise the bar above that level of discourse. I mean, that is what the Liberality Channel is supposed to be all about, right?
Yeah, I don't think anyone is going to imply that actually it would be a good thing to inject disinfectant or anything, or that light can somehow save us.
Is that what people have been saying on the internet?
It's what Trump has been saying, so yes.
Please tell me you are shitting me.
No, absolutely not. Guys, you heard it first, that actually Dr. Andy Farnell, computer scientist extraordinaire, had not heard about what Trump had been saying about
guys,
disinfectant and light.
Look, I make a great effort to, and I'm proud to admit this, I do make a great effort to insulate myself from a lot of the mainstream media and the mainstream news, because it is just so disruptive to coherent thought. Yeah. It is so disruptive to rational, sceptical reflection on things. So tell me more about what your thoughts are on immunity, so-called immunity passports. That sounds a very fluffy way of describing a tech fascist instrument to me.
I want to start with the fact that there can be no safety without privacy. And I think that this is something that probably Freud intuitively knew about the practice of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, that if a safe place was to be created for people to actually talk freely without being inhibited, so could actually be honest, could actually maybe talk about some really deep-seated fears, anxieties, fantasy.
Precisely the things that they can't do on modern social media, because everybody knows in their heart that they're under constant surveillance and scrutiny, right?
I wonder whether people actually have pushed that from their mind and are actually in denial about that. But I would say that privacy is a real tenet of emotional security. And as an attachment theorist, actually there can be no secure base without privacy. It is the fundamental reason why I do not, for example, install a Nest doorbell in my consulting room that might trace patients, do video facial recognition, and that when a patient arrives, I will turn my smartphone off.
But people will say, Kate, that, well, you're a psychotherapist who deals with patients, and that's a very specific and niche area of human life, in order to minimise that. But what you said to me earlier just really struck a chord, which was that for everybody there can be no mental health without privacy.
Yeah, and I think that Snowden, in his Christmas address a few years ago, really highlighted the idea of, have you never had just a private thought that you want to remain private?
The phrase that sticks in my mind is psychoanalysis in reverse, which is the way that I think Horkheimer or Adorno, one of the kind of Frankfurt guys, described the process of modern culture, was to take everything that's part of your innermost soul and expose it to the public. And at the same time to take everything which is part of the public realm, which is shared, and force that into your inner psyche. It's the very... Well, I think of it as a force of anti-humanism. It's essentially human to have private thoughts, to have secrets, to have plans for your life, maybe plans for other people, maybe hopes and dreams or whatever. And you cannot exist. There can be no real human life in a world in which that's taken away.
You're right, and that has some real ethical dilemmas. For example, there is an ethical dilemma in psychotherapy of what happens if, when restrictions are lifted in terms of social distancing and psychotherapists return to seeing face-to-face patients, what would then happen in terms of tracing, in terms of consent to share information? For example, if the therapist had tested positive for COVID-19, would that therapist be obliged to share the contact details of their patients?
Yeah, well, I do know that the legalities and the best practices and the things that professional bodies like the UKCP and so on have to say about those kinds of things are very intricate, and I don't quite want to get too far into that discussion. You know, obviously there are times when you do disclose things, you know, if you think someone's at a risk to themselves or to others.
My preference would be with the patient's consent.
With the patient's consent.
And with that having been discussed.
But let's look at what's happening with this so-called immunity passport. And I'm repeating myself from earlier comments here, but, you know, I don't think that the virus really has very much to do with this. This has been waiting in the wings for a long time, and the current crisis is an excuse that the authoritarians and the tech fascists have been absolutely, they are now rubbing their hands together with glee, with the opportunity to roll out much more oppressive and ubiquitous social control in the form of tracking of behaviours, buying habits, association. You know, this goes right back to apartheid. To me, it goes right back to 1930s. It's the equivalent of people being asked to wear a yellow star, you know, to me. And if you're not prepared to pick a side now and see that that's what's coming, you'll be like those people were by 1942. You know, you'll be dead or in a camp. So I think it's very important to recognise this for what it really is.
Because security involves freedom, and for example the freedom to opt out and the freedom not to share information. You and I have spoken in the past privately about the behaviour of the tech giants being almost like an intrusive partner, and whereas I, as a therapist, in hearing, for example, someone saying, my partner demands that they know everything about where I go, who I speak to, what I brought at the supermarket.
Total information awareness.
Yeah, what I'm thinking. Even, you know, I would say to a patient, that feels somewhat like coercive control. Well,
it is control.
Yeah.
The quote, which I still haven't managed to source yet, but it's stuck in my mind like a splinter, is one never maps a territory that one doesn't intend to conquer.
Yeah.
And think about how that applies to Google Maps. Think about how that applies to all forms of surveillance. There's no sense in which those things can be benign. They can't be anything but loaded with a future intent to control.
It raises the question of what the appeal of the products of these big tech giants is. And my thinking is the phrase that, again, I don't know who to attribute this to appropriately, but feels quite relevant to the discussion now, is the saying that people who think that technology will save them understand neither their problems nor technology very well.
Very few people understand technology. Yeah. There is a huge dearth of education in our schools and universities as well, since the humanities were decimated. To be honest, as a computer scientist, I would say that this belongs on the computer science syllabus, certainly for freshmen, is modern tech critique, you know, and not just the stuff of kind of like Neil Postman and Marshall McLuhan and Ivan Illich and all of these kind of. There's a huge body of literature of people who, for certainly decades, maybe centuries, have had a deeply critical relationship with understanding and trying to direct technology. Today, there's only black and white. There is a camp of people who are fetishise technology and are gushingly enthusiastic about it, and a group of people, and they only see others as being Luddites and kind of idiots of some kind. It's very rare and disturbing for them, I think, when they encounter someone like me, well educated and knowledgeable in technology and has spent their life dedicated to it, and yet is harshly critical of it. And one of the problems that we have with Silicon Valley and with lots of technology today is that it's solutions looking for a problem. It's stuff that has great private economic value if you can foist it on people, if you can get them to use it somehow, but it doesn't really give them much utility. I mean, not when you examine it in depth. There's a lot of technology where not having it is not much worse than having it. So there's always this constant temptation to push it and push it and push it into places it just doesn't belong in human life.
And maybe this brings us back to the issue of immunity passports, because an area that you seem to be implying that big tech actually absolutely does not belong is in our health records and in our surveillance of our contacts.
I don't think it does. No, I think it's extraordinarily dangerous to mix those things. Yeah. And like voting can be done with paper records, and still is in this country. We still use paper records in this country. A system which is entirely voluntary, entirely elective, and really is based on I would say GPs. I say GPs. I mean, they're already heavily overloaded in what they do, but they belong right at the centre of this, because I think what we're going to get onto in a moment is how technology breaks and distorts relationships. Yeah. But a patient's relationship is with their GP. Yeah. Not with some big data company, not with some private data miners.
Are secure bases secure?
No, but right now they're not at all.
Absolutely.
If you have a smartphone, your base is not secure. It is an always-on tracking and potential surveillance device.
I am thinking in terms of not just the relationship that we have with technology and whether we choose or not to have a smartphone, whether we choose or not to use Facebook or Google. But I would say that actually our secure bases, and I'm very deliberately using the language of attachment theory here, are actually our emotional relationships, usually kind of with the people that we talk about, usually with our family, but are also present with the people that we work with, and are definitely present with the medical people that might be treating us when we are at our most vulnerable, because that experience of vulnerability puts us right back in a position of abject dependence. And so our attachment systems are absolutely activated when we set foot in a place like hospital, because we are dependent on the actions of someone else, and it is absolutely terrifying, the prospect that people face these days of worrying, is this person that I am dependent on, whether I choose to be or not, am I a risk to them? Or are they a risk to me? Yeah,
so this is what came up in the interview with Sarah, with Dame Sarah Cowley. Yeah. Just want to say a word about who Dame Sarah Cowley is for our listeners?
She's a pioneer of health visiting.
Yeah, and Sarah was saying to me in another interview that there was a huge problem with being a health visitor, that you had to do this balancing act of, on the one hand, being an instrument of the state, potentially being intruding like social workers can do into private lives, and having the interests of mothers and families, and that what enabled that was selective information gathering, was the ability to omit things from records, to interpret them, and to record them in a way that best served the interests of the patient. Well, patient's the wrong word, the service user, I guess you'd say these days, right? And the more that technology encroaches into medicine and into social work and into all of this stuff, the less it serves the interests of the patients.
Absolutely. I absolutely had my own experience of that in working with families in mental health services, where I would make judgment calls as to what information I would record, what information I would share and with whom, and with what information I didn't feel that it was appropriate to record.
Now, why? Tell me about those patients and what risks they faced.
Where there were families with domestic violence and the risk was ongoing, my view was that I would think that it was incredibly important that professionals reading my notes would be aware of what was happening in my work with families. But
there was code within, there was a professional code in your profession.
Yes, in the fact that I would mark the records that I wrote, third-party information, confidential, not to be disclosed.
I hoped you were going to tell me about the Sri Lankans and, those
absolutely
those patients who were, their families were in very real risk of murder and torture back home.
But there were two starkly contrasting circumstances. One, when I was working with Tamil families who were in contact with the Red Cross during the Civil War, and I would want to make sure that the spelling of the Tamil names was absolutely correct, because if I got that information wrong, it may mean that actually someone years down the line, looking through records or in contact with the Red Cross, would not make contact with a long-lost relative that they might otherwise. The direct opposite extreme to that was when I thought that there might be a circumstance where there might be either an oppressive individual or be an oppressive state, bearing in mind that I was working with people who had been tortured in their country of origin by the state. I had no way of knowing whether that state's surveillance system, might be able to...
Well, we know that state actors are active within other nations, so that the Chinese, for example, have many spies and many backdoors potentially.
And so that trauma might be personal. So, for example, a survivor of domestic violence might say to me, I do not want this recorded, in which case I would write, patient did not wish any record of what was to be disclosed to be recorded, but equally that person might be reporting state terror as well. So there is that need for judgment, human judgment
for healthcare professionals to choose and to select the information and interpret the information. Do you think, or would you agree, that the people who conceive applications like this and the people who are the drivers, the facilitators of state surveillance, are really very naive about information? You always imagine that they're kind of the brightest and best of communications theory and semantics and semiotics, and that they understand implications and so on. But I think actually, I've got to say, a lot of people in the tech industry and in that area, intellectual dwarfs of the lowest order, they really seem to not get some profoundly important problems and side effects and consequences of designing these applications. And when I speak to other security researchers, when I speak to people like Ross Anderson or people like that who do get these things, who write voluminously on security engineering, on cybersecurity, on InfoSec and stuff, they are equally gobsmacked, I think, by the lack of clear vision and careful thought that goes into these kinds of ideas. What do you think? And you've already mentioned that there's an unconscious, a collective unconscious, and I kind of wanted us to maybe get into this thing that terrifies me, is that we all go to the window and cheer for the NHS, and at the same time that feels incredibly connected. It feels, it really presses all of those buttons that you will hear people like Jordan Peterson and Stefan Molyneux and all of the kind of, well, people consider them right-wing thinkers. They're not at all, they're just smart thinkers, right? But understand about the human psychology of crowd mentality and groupthink, and how the NHS could be used semiotically. The lovely blue and white symbol of the NHS could so easily be hijacked by tech fascism. and because there is a deep appeal there to our unconscious fears of infection, of disgust, of difference from other groups of people, and we've all felt it walking in the street in the last few weeks. Those are very, very dangerous sociological forces. What do you think of that?
Absolutely. I think that on the one hand, I do cheer for the NHS.
I cheer for the NHS.
But I am worried that sort of atmosphere of a kind of blitz spirit is going to be a massive distraction from how underfunded and underappreciated the NHS has been.
It's in ruins, isn't it?
Absolutely. I would say it is in ruins. It certainly was my experience of working in psychiatry. It was absolutely heartbreaking. Things such as, referral criteria, where the atmosphere, the attitude almost seemed to be communicated that unless you're suicidal or a risk to others, we will not treat you or offer you any sort of care, by which case it's far too late often. I mean, we know that this current crisis is going to have a massive mental health impact, and there have been massive surges, a twofold increase in calls to domestic violence support lines. There have been a massive rise in actual murders since lockdown. And ironically, I wonder whether there is something about the lack of privacy and the lack of volition behind that leads to mental health problems and violence. And that actually the tech companies with very blanket applications are, at worst, a very, very blunt tool to, for a very, very kind of big problem. It's actually workers such as midwives that know the details of people's lives.
This is what Sarah would say.
Absolutely. Things like whether a child is wanted, whether a child is at risk.
Well, a GP would as well. I mean, the family doctor.
Absolutely.
And that role is kind of obviously been corroded now by expedient medicine and over-systematisation. But, the relationship you have with the family doctor, of course it's a confidential one, because your GP really knows all of the nitty-gritty and should. And that's the one person, almost like a priest, who you would trust with that level of intimacy. And what a responsibility to carry it. Well, what happens when you can't discharge your confidentiality functions anymore because some tech fascist company has taken over your systems and basically hacked the computer that you're forced to use?
I think that it's worse and more traumatic than that. And
the BMA should be all over this. If there's any professionalism left in medicine, they should be all over this. I don't understand why not.
Recently, I've had phone calls from medics, and the last thing that a very experienced GP said at the end of a phone call, "Take care." And my inclination was wanting to say to him, "No, you take care. You take care because you are more at risk than actually we are." And there being something difficult about that, because we want to believe that the people caring for us are somehow immune from human frailties.
I think that's a really good point.
I've got two questions. Andy, the two questions that I wanted to ask you, I'll start with what you believe a post-corona world will look like.
Wow. What would a post-corona world look like? Well, I think it would look very much like it does right now. My worst fear is that nothing changes at all.
Yeah.
No. I kind of had this thing I said to you before about doing the mental arithmetic of utilitarianism and what our grandparents had fought for in the war to stave off fascism. And but we're in another crisis at the same time. We're in a crisis of environmentalism. And I'm very torn because part of me thinks this is a golden opportunity for us to change the way that we live.
Yeah.
And that would be very painful and very harsh for everybody. That we would all suffer economic loss. That, you know, the idea of foreign holidays would disappear, you know. And I would be quite prepared to accept that the government came and said, I'm sorry guys, we've had, 50 years of subsidised air travel. Those days are over now. We're rationing holidays. Every 3 years, your family can travel to Tenerife or whatever, Maybe you'd have tokens or something like that. Maybe you'd accrue some kind of air allowance miles that would let you do stuff like that. I'd like to see private cars off the roads the way they are now, just people making essential journeys. Wouldn't that be amazing if we could just keep breathing the lovely air that we have now and hearing the birds singing and the bees and things like that? There's so many potentially good things to come out of this as a warning to humanity to kind of change our ways. So what do I see, my optimistic self sees as a post-corona world is one in which we've learned lots of the lessons from Dana Meadows on the limits of growth and the limits of expansive economies, that we've learned to have zero growth economies, that we think more about maintenance and sustenance than development all of the time. The cynical side of me just imagines everything going back to normal but worse. In many kind of mathematical models that you have in stick, slip, friction and so on, when you interrupt something, when it returns it comes back 10 times as bad. So, yeah, and this is one of the fears that the government legitimately have, I think, and the easing of restrictions, is that the moment you take the brakes off, people will go crazy. They'll be out partying and you'll have a second wave, a second resurgence in infection. The worst case scenario, I think, is that it turns out when we really dig down into this virus that it's not a pandemic, it's a new endemic, and that there's a 10 or 20 year period in which there are diseases going around which remain transmissible, even that you can't really build immunity to, and are always going to be a risk to the health service and to people's lives, obviously, but something that we're not prepared to build a health service to cope with. So if in that case, if the biology turns out in that way, what we would need to do is to start the equivalent of an arms race, but a health race. That's my post-COVID world, is a health race, like the Cold War, in which nations compete to build the best damn health service that they can.
Wow.
That would be amazing. That would be the best outcome.
Yeah.
The worst outcome is that intellectually naive forces within government and intelligence services and law enforcement see the corporate state, the tech fascists and big tech, see this as a way to kind of follow a Chinese model of enacting draconian social control on people for the purposes of continual political and economic manipulation. That for them the COVID virus is a great gift that just accelerates the descent into a dystopia. They're an amazing possible future and a really fucking awful one. And I think, to me, that's why I'm feeling the need to answer Dan's question.
For me, I think that what a post-corona world might look like is, my hopes are that a post-corona world would be a society that valued authentic human relationships and relatedness a lot more. that understood that technology is not necessarily the answer to our problems, that actually, valued human interactions, the sort of things that Balby was talking about, separation distress, proximity seeking, the idea that our partners and our parents can be a secure base that we leave from, and a safe haven that we return to, and that actually my hope would be that we keep big tech companies, big tech giants, the kind of Silicon Valley sewer, in check, and we actually don't mediate our emotional relationships quite as much as we do through these big data gathering organisations. Before we say our good nights, I wonder whether actually you can say something about comments that you've made in discussions that we've had about whistleblowers and about the courage that it takes to tell the truth in the face of enormous pressure to do otherwise.
I've said a lot about courage, and that having just finished Snowden's book and found it full of meaty goodness, really, really enjoyed Edward Snowden's book. I think here's the problem. Everybody knows that now is a time that demands great courage.
Yeah.
And by that I mean simple honesty. It's already a tragedy that to speak of honesty is to cloak it in the language of courage, right? I mean, just to say what is self-evident truths and the things that are your deeply held values, to feel that you need courage to do that is already a tragedy, right? With regards to technology, I think we haven't reached any kind of critical mass, or even the beginnings of people being honest with themselves about their relationships with technology. I think they're utterly dependent, addicted, and in denial. I think we have a huge, huge social problem with computer technology right now. It's an enormous disappointment to me as a computer scientist. It gives me huge pangs of self-doubt that I've wasted my life, that I've contributed to huge problems and not solutions. But I do see glimmers of, when courage happens, when a sea change is afoot, it's like a flock of birds taking off. You see a few kind of fluttering here and there, but then there's one moment and nobody knows why, and none of the birds know why. They all take off. It's an epiphenomenal event. It's an emergent phenomenon. And there are always little warning signs just before. They're little things that tell you that there's going to be a change. And when The Economist started to write about the tech clash, I kind of thought, oh, here it comes. It didn't take the tech fascists long to kind of paint that with the Luddite brush, to kind of marginalise people who were having second thoughts about their relationships with technology. But I'm continually seeing signs that people want to retake tech. They're small, even hard to describe things, but they keep me filled with hope. That there's the possibility for that change. Whistleblowing is a poisonous word, because a situation in which an institutional society is so broken that all the mechanisms of legitimate change and challenging and bottom-up democratic control are so broken, so dysfunctional, that anybody who sees a problem is silenced for so long and suppressed for so long, they're eventually forced into a situation where they have to act radically. That's a really, really broken system, and that's what happened to Snowden. It is tragic. It's really tragic to read his story, because to me there's so many affinities. I have so many parallels I see with his childhood and his father's service record and things like that. And to me it was like, wow, I'm kind of reading the story of somebody who's 20 years younger than me and grew up and was. If I'd been in those shoes, I'd do the same thing. I would not compromise those values for defending freedom and democracy and, the right to be a free-thinking, rational individual. I would not hesitate to do what Snowden did. And so he's an absolute bloody hero. But the fact that people have to go to those lengths and therefore there's so few of them, that's a real problem. I think we need a revolution in that perception of the courage and necessity of clear, honest, open speech in a way that just opens the floodgates. We need that flock of birds just taking off so that there isn't anybody that could be singled out as the whistleblower. Everybody's a Spartacus.
A final thought before we say our good nights is that something that was often said to me, and I think was in a line of a poem written by an accident and emergency nurse during this pandemic, was about times where people within the NHS would say to fellow workers who were expressing discontent about certain issues, don't make this political. My view and understanding is that our healthcare system, the NHS, will always be political. The personal will always be political. And
I think the people who say those kinds of things, like "don't make this political," are what's a charitable word that our listeners can hear? I don't know. There's no realm of politics that doesn't impinge on the personal and the individual. And your health, absolutely, I agree, is totally.
And the technology behind that health is.
It's everybody's problem. Yeah. I would really hope that everyone in the NHS gets to hear our good stuff. Good stuff on the Liberality channel.
Well, this is good stuff saying good night. Good night.
Good night.